Today we are looking at the book of Numbers, the Numbers as they're wandering in the wilderness, those children of Israel. Let me share my screen with you here, the book of Numbers. And we in class we always do the Shema. Hopefully you know that. And then the creation, fall, promise, God. We're in the wilderness right now. We're in the wilderness part, and we've been given the law. And now the question is, are they going to be faithful to that law? And the answer in Numbers is no. They don't really do a very good job of that. They flunk the test. So the word numbers literally means numbers, right? There's two censuses. There's a census at the beginning of the book of Numbers, and then there's a census at the end. Numbers begins at Mount Sinai. They've just received the law, and they've all said, "We will do this. We will do this. We are all in. Yes, yes, God, you're awesome. You're great. I'm all for you." And so then they take off, but then they run into problems, right? Um, and then what happens is they end up like almost to the promised land, but they chicken out. And so then there's a census that happens of all the fighting men of that would be able-bodied to carry out a battle, and those guys aren't able to go into the promised land. And then later there's another census, a second census of the young generation, the new generation, and they're just about ready to go into the promised land. So the two censuses are on either side of like a 40-year kind of experience. The big idea of Numbers is God's promise, his covenant plan stays on track even when we don't. These guys are unfaithful to God, but God is still faithful to see them through. Now the question is, why did they wander in the wilderness for 40 years? I mean, couldn't they have like used GPS or something? Why was it such a long wandering? And the reason is found in the book of Deuteronomy, the very next book at the beginning. It says, "Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years." This is really the book of Numbers. The 40 years happens there to humble you and to test you in order to know what is in your heart. And so whether or not you're going to keep his commands. And so that's the question. This is a test, and Numbers shows us the test and how they pass or fail the test. Well, they flunked the test. they flunked the test. And the test is not like, say, a Pentateuch test like you take for a class. The test is like a driver's test that you have to keep on taking it until you learn the lesson. And so this is what we see here. There's a humility test, and then there's an obedience test just to see what's in your heart. And sometimes when we're going through the hard stuff, it's not that God hates you and he's out to get you. He's not mad at you. What he's trying to do is for you to be aware of what is inside your heart. It's testing you. And if you have the same issue that you keep coming up against over and over and over and over again, it's probably because there's a test there that you need to pass. And so eventually God's going to help you and you're going to pass that test, and then that issue won't be such a problem for you anymore. So basically, there's three main sections of the book of Numbers. First of all, he's mobilizing his people. He's getting them ready to go. And so he gives them instructions. Let's go, and they're all in. They're excited. It's like a sports team at the beginning of the season. They're ready. We're going to win all our games, and then they mess up, right? And that's the second section where God shows his disfavor with their disobedience. And then the third section is there's a new generation. They're ready to go into the promised land. This is where the second census comes in, right? So it's three different sections of Numbers. This kind of gives it a little more detail. God gives his law and order, what he expects, but they don't do it, this disorder. And so then there's some new laws then that God gives, or a new repeat of the law. And okay, now you're ready to go into the land to actually take it. So they leave Mount Sinai and they end up at a place called Kadesh. And at Kadesh is where they're going to go in to take the promised land. This just happens in a 2-month period between the time they leave, and that's about a year that they're they're at Mount Sinai, and then it's like 2 months that they're on their way to journey. They're on their way to win, but then they chicken out, and then for 38 years they're stuck in no man's land, just wandering around. So they're moving out, they're moving on, but they're wandering. And then finally, just for a few months, they're on their way and they're just about ready to go. And the leader of this whole thing is Moses. Now, this actually goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 12. And actually, it's also in Genesis 13, it's Genesis 15. God appears to Abraham. Remember, we talked about Abraham and his covenant, his promise to Abraham, and his promise and call to Abraham. And the promise is, I'm going to give you people, I'm going to make a nation out of you, and I'm going to give you a land. And to your descendants, he says, I'm going to give you this land. And he shows Abraham the land and says, and this is going to be your land for your people someday. At this point, Abraham is barren. He has no kids, but yet God is doing this. And what we see here in the book of Numbers is actually Abraham's descendants now coming towards that land. And what we see here is that right after God makes this promise to Abraham, he builds an altar to God saying, okay, yes, I'm all in for him. So what we see in this is that there's a promise. God says, I'm going to give you the land. And then there's a response of, yes, I will do whatever you want me to do so that I can possess the land. A covenant has two parts. Right? Remember, there are promises and there are obligations. And so Abraham says, I'm going to do it. He says, yes. And now it's his people, it's their time, and God is giving them the land. He's promising it to them. The question is, are they going to say yes? Now, they say yes with their mouths at the first part of Numbers, but when it actually comes to where the rubber meets the road, that's where they don't say yes. They say no. Because here's the problem. The yes response calls for courage. It calls for a fight. And sometimes we don't want to fight. We'd rather just take the easier route. We would rather not mess with that. There are two stages in this fight as they respond to God's call and say yes to God's call. The first stage is when God fights against the Egyptians to deliver them. And even there, they're not totally convinced of it. Moses has to do a lot of convincing. But finally that happens and they leave and they go through the Red Sea and the soldiers come after them and they all get drowned in the sea. God actually fights the fight for them. Remember, the Egyptian gods and Yahweh, the God of Israel, they fight against each other. God wins, but God does the fighting. The Israelite slaves don't have to do anything. All they have to do is just go along with God's fight and just live in the favor of that. But the second stage is they have to actually be prepared to fight themselves. They have to roll up their sleeves and do some battle on their own. And this is where they don't want to do it. This is where they chicken out because they don't think of themselves as strong enough, brave enough, good enough, whatever, to fight the good fight of faith. Now, we talked about the two censuses already. There it is. The first census is in the first chapter, and the second census is towards the end of the book. And there are just a little over 500,000 fighting men in the first one, but the fighting men are ready to go, but then they wimp out. And then the second group, they're ready to go, and they actually go do it. So they're good for the rising generation. Sometimes old folks, they just, they need to move out of the way to let the young people do their thing. So again, this is the sections of Numbers. He's mobilizing his people, getting them ready. But they wimp out, they give up. This is the testing right here. And then he gets a new generation ready because they're wandering in the wilderness. Then after they end up in Kadesh, they just wander around for a long time until they get to the plains of Moab, which is right at the very end. Now, as they're camping, do you notice this is the layout to this as in the book of Numbers? Like this is the tents, this is the tabernacle in the middle. What is that shaped like? Isn't that interesting? And Judah is the tribe that leads the way ever. And Jesus actually comes from the tribe of Judah. So we have even a foreshadowing of the cross of Christ right here. And he's the one that fights our battles for us. I love this part. This shows up at the very first part of the book of Numbers. This is as he's mobilizing the people. The season is about ready to start, and the coach is giving them this rah-rah speech. And he says, "The Lord bless you and keep you and make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you his peace." You know that song, that's just a beautiful, beautiful song. And it's a blessing song. And oh, they could have just lived in that blessing. If they would have just walked in the blessing, it wouldn't have taken them 40 years to wander in the wilderness. But unfortunately, they were humans and they were doubting and fretting. And so they mess up. The place that they mess up is a place called Kadesh, and they're just about ready. They can see the promised land. So they send some spies over to the promised land to check it out and say, okay, what do we need to do to take this land? They send 12 spies, one from each of the tribes. The spies come back, and 10 give a bad report and 2 give a good report. And the bad report spies, they say, oh, well, it's a beautiful land. It's really good. It's flowing with milk and honey, all kinds of fruit, vegetation. Now, these guys have been in a wilderness, a barren wilderness. So this is amazing. It's like an oasis. But there are giants there. These Nephilim are there. These guys are too big. They're bigger than life. We're like grasshoppers in our own eyes. And we look like that to them too. They had this grasshopper mentality. Now, first of all, this is totally exaggerated. First of all, there aren't any Nephilim there because the Nephilim are gone. They all died in the flood. They whoever these Nephilim were, they weren't there. They just thought that they were there. They just imagined that they were there. They might be big guys, but they weren't. They weren't unbeatable. I mean, shoot, the bigger they are, the harder they fall, right? We see that with David and Goliath. And it says we seemed like grasshoppers in our eyes and the way to them too. So in other words, what they're thinking is, I'm just imagining this, right? The giants were in their head. God was bigger than those guys. God had already defeated the greatest world power of the day, Egypt. And these cities, they weren't a great world power. They were just city states. They were just like little cities. I mean, they had walls and stuff around them, but each one had its own little despot ruler, and they could fight them. They could fight them, but they didn't. They felt inferior, and they let their inferiority get in the way of God's best for them. And you can do that too. Don't ever let your inferiority get in the way of God's best for you. Now, Joshua and Caleb, they saw it. They said, "Man, we can do this. Let's take it. Let's say we got this. We can do this." But the 10 said no, and they vote no. And then the children of Israel all follow the 10, and they say, "No, we're not going to do it." And then God judges them. God judges them and says, okay, then none of you guys are going to go to the promised land. If you guys don't believe, if you don't have enough faith to get in, then you're not going to go. The only ones that are allowed are Joshua and Caleb and their families, but none of the rest of you guys that are of fighting age and older, you guys are all going to die. You're not going to make it to the promised land. Then they're like, no, okay, we'll do it. We'll do it. No, don't do it. We're going to do it anyway. And they go in, they try, and they get whopped. And so then they come back and they say, okay, I guess we're stuck. And so then for 38 years now, which makes 40 a total, they just start wandering around in the wilderness. And this is that second section of the book of Numbers where they say no to God. And because they said no to God, God just brings judgment on them. And over and over and over again, we see God's ways and then them fighting against it and saying no, and stupid stuff happening, because when you say no to God, you do stupid things. Now, God is still with Moses. God loves Moses, and Moses loves God. Moses was just trying to lead them well, but he couldn't get them to obey and do the right things. As Moses is trying to listen to God and take them the places that God wants them to go, there's a rebellion that rises up against them. There's a guy named Korah, and there are a couple of other guys that just rise up and say, "Who gives you the right to lead us? I'm going to be the leader." And so, like, there's a rebellion against Moses and Aaron, and it comes to a head. And Moses prays about it, and he says, "Okay, here's what God says to do: have a representative from each of the tribes bring a stick, bring a staff, And so they all bring a staff, like one that represents them. And then they prayed about it and they said, the staff that blooms overnight, that is the one that will show God's favor. And that's what God told him to do. So he does it. And then the next day, Aaron's staff is budding. And so that staff actually ends up in the Ark of the Covenant later on. So that, remember, it's a jar of manna, Aaron's staff, and a copy of the 10 Commandments. That's what's inside. That might show up on your test. But anyway, that staff blooms, Aaron's staff blooms. And so then everybody realizes that God is with Aaron. And so then they're like, oh, wow, okay. And so Moses asked the people to stand before him, those who have been enemies that have resisted against him, they stand before him. And then all of a sudden, God just opens up the earth. There's this huge earthquake, and these guys all fall in to the earth. And then the earth closes back up again on them. And everybody goes, whoa, that's crazy, right? That's crazy. So Moses is going through some stuff, though, emotionally. He's not emotionally healthy. He's had opposition and he's been defensive, and he just feels on edge. And then Miriam dies, his sister Miriam, his big sister who saved him, his big sister who was with him, who sang the praises as they crossed the Red Sea. And she's been his comfort and safety person. And now she's dead. And then they start running out of water. They don't have enough water. Um, and Moses just gets so angry with them, and he says, you stupid rebels, and he prays about it, and God says, just speak to the rock and water will flow. It's okay, Moses, you just speak. They need a word from you. They need a comforting word from you, a word of encouragement from you. But instead of a word of encouragement, he takes his stick and and he whacks that rock in anger, just blows a gasket and smacks the rock. You know, he's supposed to just speak a word of blessing and encouragement, and instead he's just using his rod to smash the rock. And then water comes. They get the water. He gets the results that he wants, but he loses respect. He loses his credibility. Sometimes when you're a leader, you can get the result that you want, but lose your credibility in the way that you act or react, particularly in stress. And so this is what happened. He's under stress and he overreacts in a certain way. And because of this, God says, Moses, you overreact in stress. You're not going to be able to be the leader into the promised land. I'm sorry, but you're not the guy for the job. Sadly, Aaron dies right after that too, and his son Eleazar takes his place. This is Moses's nephew. So Moses is so sad. His heart is full of grief. He's gone through all these things. Now he can't even go to the promised land, and his sister died. Now his brother dies. People have been against him. He's just dealing with his stuff. And then to top it off, it gets even worse. They end up like in the wilderness, just in an area where there's just a lot of vipers. There's these poisonous snakes, and they start biting people, and people get sick, and they die. They die. And so they cry out to Moses, and Moses cries out to God and says, what are you doing, God? This is just bad enough. It just keeps getting worse. And God tells Moses to make a snake out of bronze, to make a snake, and to put it on a stick, a staff, and hold it up. And anyone who looks to the stick, looks to the snake, will live. And that's what happens. He makes the snake, puts it on a stick, holds it up, and they look to it and live. That snake is called Nehushtan. That's the name of the snake. That they look to the snake and they live. Now, why a snake, and why that goes all the way back to the curse of sin with a serpent, isn't it? But God is greater than the bite of the viper. God is greater than our sin, and we look to healing, look to God over our sin. I don't know exactly why the snake was on top of it. It's maybe should have been underneath it or something, but that's the way it was. Nehushtan is the name of that. And the Greek god Asclepius, he has a snake, a serpent on a staff, that is used as the medical symbol. But and so the people say that that medical symbol is, from this Greek god, but actually it's derived from Nehushtan. It came 500 years earlier. The Greeks just borrowed that. They liked the story, but they took that and adapted it for their own, for that. So really, when you see this medical symbol, it's about the book of Numbers and Moses looking, letting them look and to live. And by the way, Jesus says in the book of John, chapter 3, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. And then it goes on. That's 3:14. And then it goes on, because if you look to him, you live, you have everlasting life. And then it goes, for God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten son. You know that verse, right? Whosoever believes in him shall not perish, shall not die by the viper bite of sin, but will receive eternal life. And so that greatest verse of the Bible is tied directly to the Nehushtan snake. The Nehushtan snake, by the way, later becomes a snare because people start worshiping the snake rather than worshiping the God who is the healer. Now, there's this weird prophet. His name is Balaam. He's not like an Israelite. He's a pagan prophet, but he likes a fortune teller kind of guy. And the king of Moab. They're coming towards the end. They're coming towards the promised land now. The old people are dying out, like with snake bites and earthquake swallows and things like that. The young folks are still around though, and they're beginning to win. They actually have a couple of battles and they win, and the word gets out that these Israelites are here, and that's kind of dangerous. And there's this guy, the king of Moab. He says, "Oh man, we better fight against them." And so he hires Balaam. He pays him cash money, pays him megabucks to come in and to offer a curse, to put a curse on the Israelites, so the Israelites will lose. So Balaam's on his way to go curse the Israelites, and he's riding his donkey, and all of a sudden his donkey just stops, and Balaam like hits his donkey, and the donkey just sits down, and and the donkey starts, and then he sits down like 3 different times. He's just whacking away on his donkey, and his donkey won't go anywhere, and um, and then the donkey speaks to him and he says, "Why are you beating me?" And then Balaam gets all the matter and he says, "I'd kill you." So he starts arguing with the donkeys. Well, it seems like Balaam should pay attention. If you have a donkey that starts talking to you, you better pay attention. And then an angel appears in front of him, an angel with a sword in his hand. And the angel said, "Your donkey just saved your life. Your donkey saved your life. Now listen, don't pronounce curses upon God's people. Pronounce blessings on them instead." And so then Balaam obviously obeys God there, and he goes on his way and begins to pronounce blessings instead of curses upon the people, much to the chagrin of the guy that hired him to do the exact opposite. Crazy enough, the book of Numbers ends with a cliffhanger. They're on their way to the promised land. They're almost there. They're just there. They're almost there. And then it ends. It doesn't put them into the promised land. They just get stuck. They're right at the edge, but they don't get in. It's like a book where you come to the climax, and instead of resolving it, it just stays there. And so basically the last verses, these are the commands and the judgments which the Lord commanded at the hand of Moses unto the children of Israel in the plains of Moab by the Jordan near Jericho. And that's the way it ends. And we have to wait till we get to the book of Joshua before they cross the Jordan River and they go into the book of Jericho. But we have another book to get to before we can go there, and that's the book of Deuteronomy. And we'll talk about that one next time.